From Redox and Healthcare Strategy Bullpen, welcome to Diagnosing Healthtech, the show where we talk about healthcare and the technology driving it with the most interesting leaders in the industry.
I'm Jeff Englander. I'm the host of Diagnosing Healthtech, and I'm joined by Sarah Botchin, my co-host. We are honored to have Dr. John Halamka here today. John is really a legend in health tech, and he goes without introduction. John is the former CIO of Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He is now the president of Mayo Clinic Platform, which we'll dig into more. John has written approximately, bear with me 1 second while I double check that note. John has
Well, hey,
written,
Jeff, I finished the 15th last June, on the 16th book now.
On the 16th book. It's amazing, and he has written hundreds of articles, and for those who don't know John, John has the largest shelter for orphaned and abandoned animals in the Northeast, 17 acres in Sherborne, Massachusetts, which is absolutely beautiful. If you've never been there, I encourage you to go. It's really a labor of love, and it's really beautiful to see. So welcome, John. Thank you for joining us.
Well, always thrilled to talk to you. And of course, given that healthcare IT, generative AI, digital health, this is the top of mind of every publication in the world. So what a timely interview it is today.
Well, thank you. So what I wanted to talk about is we talked a little bit about the prep, John, is I was digging up some of your old interviews, and I noted in one of the old interviews you talked about when we moved to the High-Tech Act, all we really did was take what we were doing in paper and turned it into digital paper, but still use all of the old processes. And now you came to Mayo in 2019. We are 4 years later, and you've created the Mayo Clinic Platform, and bear with me, I'll look at my notes again, which you describe as a distributed data network that partners with health systems, payers, medical device companies, and academic medical centers to enable better ways to treat, diagnose, and present disease. So as you go from after the High-Tech Act to what you've now created, can you walk us through some of the steps involved in that? How did you get the data to the point that you needed it?
Well, absolutely. So Sarah knows that coordination of data in healthcare has been almost ready for prime time for 20 years. The challenge with high tech is it said, let's digitize medicine. Well, we did. I mean, in the sense that we went from recording the information on paper to recording the information digitally, but we didn't give the clinicians anything back. So they spent hours and hours at their keyboards dutifully entering problems and meds and allergies, typing in notes, and then what? And so, of course, that's the question, which is if you want to give them something back, turn this from an administrative burden into an essential companion and tool, what are some of the things you need to do? Well, first would be we want to turn the data into wisdom. A lot of the data that we gather in healthcare isn't very good. It's messy. And there are huge issues of secondary use, privacy constraints, and regulatory and sub-regulatory guidance. And so one has to take the data, realize you can put it in a standard form, and that standard form has to be curated. So people don't live to 150 typically. Typically, people don't have 3 kidneys removed, right? So you have to clean it. And then once you've created this large corpus of data, then you ready it for collaboration with industry, small companies, large companies, other academic medical centers, to create novel products and services without selling the data, without for a moment exfiltrating it or potentially compromising a patient's preference for the use of their data. So much of what this last couple of years has been is this evolution from the dumb container of data to now the highly useful products and services that come out with AI models that we've validated.
And as you went through that, healthcare has, healthcare has often been compared to finance and fintech and retail, but really there you're almost only dealing with one type of data. But healthcare, you have test results, you have unstructured notes, you have lab results, you have radiographs, X-rays. What were the special things you had to do first before even getting into language, but in terms of getting the unstructured data ready to go into the form you needed it?
Well, so let me start off with a high-level example. If your Visa card is stolen, what is your loss? Oh, dollars and cents. And you're reimbursed. Done. If your HIV status is disclosed, how do you reimburse that? Right? So you're dealing with an entirely different corpus of information, not only because there are so many privacy concerns, but also in the world of finance and fintech. Oh, do I know what a dollar is? Do I know what a pound is? Do I know what a yen is? Do I know how to convert them? Sure. Oh, Jeff today has a fever. Okay, Jeff, what's a fever? Oh, is it you feel hot? You feel cold? You've got sweats? A temperature greater than 101.5 for 24 hours? So these are the sort of differences between retail, fintech, and medicine. So that implies we are going to use some of this in AI algorithms and must de-identify it. Now, imagine de-identification of structured data, removing names and phone numbers, email addresses, not so hard. Unstructured data. Well, I'm going to use a perfectly made-up example, Sarah. This patient, who is one of the founding principles of Redox, now, is that a HIPAA violation? There's no name, but all I would need to do is go to Crunchbase, and probably a high school student could figure out who I was talking about. So what that implies is that you need to remove job role, familial relationship, geography. What we did was something we call hiding in plain sight. So instead of saying, this extraordinary founder of Redox, we might say this entrepreneur with Palantir, right? Again, made this up, right? But the point being is that, it seems like it's a kind of reasonable sentence, but the re-identification of the data would be hard because the facts are simply not true. Well, here's a really interesting one. What about dates? Well, suppose that the sentence is, and this person had a baby on X date. Again, somebody could probably look into a newspaper or birth registry, look to see who had babies on that date, and potentially reassemble the identity. And these are the sorts of things you have to protect against, and we do something called date shifting. So that is, for an individual patient, we pick a random number between 1 and 90, let's say, and then every single date in their record we shift by that random number. So it's utterly consistent for that patient. But for the next patient, we pick another random number. And so you never know what the date shift is. And so these are the kinds of things with unstructured data that are harder than you'd typically find in other industries.
That's brilliant. I love that. Sarah, did you want to go ahead and throw a question into John?
Yeah, I'm just curious to learn a little bit more about the journey that you had at Mayo or in general. So when we started the conversation, you're talking about how with high-tech things became digitized. There are a lot of health systems that run kind of the chasm of readiness to be doing the kinds of work that you're doing with their data cleanliness and just in general their ability to capture data from different sources. Do you mind explaining how you got to the point, maybe not that where you're at now, but how would you know that your data is clean enough? Is that even possible? And what are some of the stages that an institution like Mayo would need to go through in order to be ready to say, okay, we've got this data now we can build on top of it and drive meaning and value, versus just being at that first stage, which is, okay, we've digitized, our systems. That's kind of stage number one. Like what is phase 2? And then how do you get to phase 3 or phase 10 or whatever you would say the stage Mayo is in?
Well, sure. So electronic health records by their nature are typically organized into episodes of care. The patient came with a complaint, a diagnosis was rendered, a treatment was given, the patient went back to wellness done. The reality is our lives are not episodes of care. Our lives are birth to death health experiences with primary care, specialty care, surgery, inpatient hospitalization. So what Mayo did, started about 5 years ago, is they said the EHR is not the right container to organize data for analytics and AI model development. It's essential for compliance and billing and all the rest, but it's just one of many data sources. So Chris Ross, the CIO at Mayo, created something called the LPR, or the Longitudinal Patient Record, that said we're going to organize every event in a person's healthcare life in a single data stream. And that means it isn't a static problem list or a single date or point in time. It's, oh, they were born. At age 4, they got this vaccine. At age 12, they had this diagnosis. At age 36, they, had this surgery. And so that reorganization of the data forced a reconciliation of 5 EHRs into a common data model with curation and cleanliness. And as you say, there's a set of internal tools we've developed to look at things like consistency, redundancy, and there are certain things in the data you wouldn't expect, like a patient probably wouldn't change their birthday 5 times. So those tools are run on this longitudinal, not EHR-based stack of data as a kind of prerequisite to all the goodness that we've been working on these last couple of years.
I know that you're solving a lot of problems using AI and using this data, so things like provider burnout and trying to have maybe a generative experience, for providers, even within the EHR. When we look at using all of this data that's compiled, I think there's, an opportunity to perhaps purchase technology that sits on top of the EHR, on top of that data. I particularly am interested in digital technologies. And then there's work like divining insights, like what you're doing with the data. How do you prioritize just usage of the data and the work that you do? On top of it isn't the right way to put it, but how do you prioritize your focus areas?
Yeah, so there's a lot of Pareto analysis you're going to do, and let me just start with even in the data prep. Okay, data is structured and unstructured, but it's also telemetry. It's images, it's omics, it's digital pathology, and then it's every registry or you've probably contributed to at a departmental level since the dawn of time. What's going to give you the greatest utility? If your utility is defined as early diagnosis, novel treatment, care journeys, these kinds of things, okay, so we literally laid out 200 different data types and said, oh, we'll start with the structured and the unstructured, then we'll move to images, then telemetry, then to digital path, then to omics, then to registries. And that became a 2-year map of all the kinds of data you're going to add. And then some of the projects you're going to want to do are actually a function of what data assets are available. So for example, it's just now that we're finishing up 12 million digital pathology slides with full annotation. And so and this is actually a true story, when a company says, God, we want to develop a novel digital biomarker, and all we need is 12 million digital pathology slides, the answer is, okay, 2024. And then one question you need to ask is democratizing access to this DID data. What Mayo did is it built something called an AI factory. And let me give you some quick examples of that. AI Factory does natural language processing, has different kinds of tools. Some are code, you write PyTorch. Some are low code, some are no code. And so let's imagine one of your tens of thousands of clinicians and employees says, God, I really wonder, what are the likely signs and symptoms that lead a patient to a positive COVID test? This is something we actually did in March of 2020. Oh, is it fever, sore throat, cough? Well, that clinician discovered it was loss of taste and sense of smell by doing NLP analysis on the records in the DID data set against the laboratory results for positive COVID tests. And that literally was like done before breakfast. So you're able to do this at very large scale across your enterprise. But be careful, because if you do this kind of thing and you bring in an engineer, and I love engineers, I am one, but somebody who doesn't have, say, healthcare domain expertise and say, here's a bunch of DoD data, go develop a model. So I had an engineer do this who said, oh my God, I have the best model ever. It's got an AUC of 0.99. I said, that's great. What is the model? He said, if you give high-dose opioids to your inpatients, you reduce readmission rates substantially.
Oh, wow.
So that would be, of course, a useless model. And he then asks, what's a palliative care unit?
Yep.
So be careful.
Right. You don't want to draw the right or the wrong conclusions. That does actually lead me to a question that I had, which, we think about de-identified data. It gives us a lot of insight, and we can use it to, do things like understand better, when a patient might have COVID, which is just, that example is fantastic. But when you're thinking about the point of care experience, do you have two sets of data? How do you apply that, non-identified data to the clinician experience? What is that like? How do you develop products or workflows from the data or insights that you bring?
Right, and so you, of course, have this brilliant question, which is the EHR is a set of operational data that does what an EHR has to do. You then have an external to the EHR data set that you use for model development and validation and various kinds of analytics. But it's really important that once you develop and validate a model, you put it back into workflow. No clinician is going to launch a separate app or a separate website. They're going to want to be in the middle of the EHR, push a button, and have magic happen. And let me give you a quick example. So we have hundreds of millions of ECGs, 12 lead, 6 lead, 1 lead. And we've got now 14 models developed on those ECGs, some in FDA 510K approval now. And they can do things like predict disease you don't yet have. And so what we do for every patient that gets an ECG at Mayo, you click a button in Epic, and it runs the 14 algorithms on the ECG and shows you these likelihoods of disease states. It's not diagnostic. I mean, this is really more educational and differential and that kind of thing. But the point being is there's zero burden to getting this AI insight in workflow, even though the models were developed outside the EHR itself.
So, John, what do you tell the person? You're very technologically sophisticated, you're very technologically adept, you've always gravitated towards technology. What do you tell the clinician who is skeptical of AI and all the things you're doing to help them, bring them in, to get them to adopt rather some of the things you're doing?
So Jeff asks probably the most important question of the day, which is, in any change management or any innovation activity, there is technology, policy, and psychology. And you're talking about the human factor, the behavior. So imagine this. I say, hey, doctor, let me show you 200 metrics of sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value, showing that this model is fair, appropriate, valid, equitable, and safe. They will look at it and say, that mathematically might be true, but it doesn't mean it's credible. I need more than just math. And so what if I said this? We did a randomized clinical trial. This is all true, by the way. And in that randomized clinical trial, we were able to diagnose patients 20% faster. We were able to have doctors get home an hour earlier. We were able to diagnose colon cancer at a much earlier stage. So you suddenly describe the clinical relevance, the clinical impact, and it's validated using a gold standard like an RCT. And then they say, oh, now that sensitivity and specificity means something to me.
That's really, really interesting. Now, on the same tack, You've got, and hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Giancarlo Ferrugia at Mayo, who is incredibly supportive in putting a lot of assets and investment into the digital platform. But to someone who isn't that lucky at another organization, what kinds of things can you advise them to do to help bring on their senior leadership team to help, them get to the point where you are?
So let me answer this in two ways. The first is solve a real business problem. So when you go speak to CEOs of hospitals and you say, would you like an algorithm? Typically what they'll say is, I can't even spell that. They'll say, I have negative margins, my clinicians are burned out, and I can't hire and retain specialists. You say, well, if those are your three business problems, what if there were tools that could help with all three? Oh, well, that would be wonderful. And so that's the way we start to demonstrate value. What Mayo has done is created, and I'm of course not here to sell anyone anything, but we've created an early disease diagnosis AI starter pack that we are placing in community hospitals to demonstrate the capabilities of AI to solve real business problems. Because then once they see that, then they say, this is actually real. This is not just some blockchain next generation hype, right? So that's really important. But another question to ask is, in 2030, knowing what you know about our industry, do you think heads and beds, fee for service, is going to be the way that hospitals thrive? How about more mergers and acquisitions? The answer is no. Right? The future is going to be the organizations that are delivering in non-traditional settings, novel digital services, creating new marketplaces. So the savvy CEO will say, God, this is existential. Unless I do this now, in 2030, I will not be competitive.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. Sarah, did you want to go ahead and get in another question? Then I have one more for John before we kind of wrap up. He's been very kind with his time.
Yeah, I think that there was something that I read that you wrote recently where you're talking about how, predictive analytics or AI are different than generative, and using the tools to show providers that you're taking away that burden has been really essential. We were actually talking about this, Jeff and I, on the last session that we hosted, which was there being still this kind of argument about who can do what specialty work and what rising to the top of your license actually means. And I think part of, the pro AI driving force is, hey, we're taking away work that doesn't let you rise to the top of your license. Has that been a part of the messaging that you've used? Do you have any thoughts about just that conceptually, or, recommendations?
Well, so absolutely. So here's an interesting question. If you are a cardiologist and you specialize in congestive heart failure, wouldn't you want to know that the patient in front of you was likely to have a low ejection fraction, right? That they are going to have a weak heart pump? Because otherwise, your specialty knowledge is potentially not going to help them so much. And so our algorithms will do things like look at your Apple Watch data and tell you your ejection fraction with, again, area under the curve, 0.93, 0.94, pretty good. And so the patients you're going to see are all ones that you're going to be able to help, right? And so at Mayo, one of the interesting issues with 7,000 clinicians is getting the right patient to the right clinician for the right treatment at the right time. And it is really hard for humans to do that sophisticated triage on their own. The AI really helps with the practice at the top of your license issue.
It feels like there's kind of some of the specialization or some of the specificity is that's just going to look different in every care setting, in the outpatient specialty setting versus the ED setting. Finding out what are the automatable parts of the clinical process or the patient experience, and then maybe not eliminating them, but allowing those to be understood and for you to fast track a patient to the right person.
Absolutely true. And so we have different models running in the ED versus med surg versus ICU. Absolutely true, because the workflows are different. But one of the things we need make sure everybody knows, AI does not replace doctors and nurses. AI makes doctors and nurses better. And let me use, a real example, Sarah. So I was trained in Southern California, right? I went to UCSF and Stanford and Harbor UCLA, and then I come to the East Coast. And as we were chatting about before the program, I developed this large red target lesion on my leg. Well, no one in Southern California has ever seen anything like that. Is that a scorpion bite? And of course, I had Lyme disease. So if the AI says, oh, I actually understand this patient's phenotype, genotype, and exposome, they've got a fever and muscle aches, you better actually do a Western blot. Oh, I would have never thought of that. You're right? And that's why the AI that we're building is really more of a safety net that ensures the clinician who's compassionate and empathetic and a great listener also has the benefit of millions of patients like the one in front of them to help guide the care journey.
So, John, let me ask one final question here. To the clinician, to the young, up-and-coming next John Halamka, who is working with these technologies, they're fairly burned out. They're spending a lot of 90 minutes of pajama time, working in the EMR, and they're seeing all these new new technologies coming. What have you learned that you didn't expect as you moved in 2019 to today, creating the Mayo Clinic Platform?
So I would argue that predictive and generative AI is moving much faster than I would have predicted and is much more useful. A quick example, I'm sure both of you have experienced ambient listening where a patient and doctor have a conversation and then the note is written automatically, right? And this is not transcription. It's truly, although it's not sentient or cognitive, it's trying to take the gist of a conversation and place it in a standard form. So I was experimenting with one of these and I said, my mom, who is in a memory care unit, has lived alone for the last 10 years. My father died 13 years ago. And the note comes out, the patient is an 81-year-old widow with dementia. Now, think about this. I didn't use the word widow. I didn't use the word dementia. I just said lived alone, my father died, is in memory care, right? And so that I wouldn't have expected. What that implies is we're going to start to see a golden era of burden reduction. So yes, the EHR will finally give you something back. You'll get decision support, a safety net, and burden reduction, and it will become an essential companion and not an administrative burden.
Well, that's been a goal of yours, I know, for many years, in part because of the rush to fund, but that's another conversation. Well, let me wrap up from Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. I want to thank you for joining us. John is always insightful. I do recommend going to see the Unity Farm. Healthcare Strategy Bullpen is here to help you figure out how to use your innovation either as an emerging healthcare startup trying to figure out how to sell into healthcare, or as a payer provider trying to figure out what is the right technology to help solve the problem you have. So please do follow us at healthcarebullpen.com, subscribe to the blog, and happy to help you if we can. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Yep, and this episode was also co-sponsored by Redox. You can check us out at redoxengine.com.
Well, hey, thanks guys for having me, and I'm always available. So look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, John.
Looking forward to it.